Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Religious Rights and Freedom of Speech. As usual, we have a webinar crowd and we're also live streaming on Facebook. So hello to everyone on Facebook. We're very thrilled to welcome you, and we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box throughout the discussion. So whenever something occurs to you, please tell us and put it down. So if you would like to say hello as well to the panelists, or let us know where you're tuning in from, please share with us in the chat. So this webinar is brought to you by the Woolf Institute. The Woolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge, and it's a place where difficult and controversial issues can be discussed and will be discussed, and discussed in a way in which we really begin to understand a variety of perspectives and motivations, which is critical in the move away from polemic discussions towards civil discussions. So by hosting these How to Talk About conversations, we really try to create a space to broaden the topics on the table and to deepen understanding. My name is Esther-Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute. And the topic we will be discussing today is that of religious rights and freedom of speech. And I'm really thrilled to welcome such an esteemed group of academic activists and journalists. No, we don't have journalists today. Sort of academics and activists we have today to unpack this topic. And let me introduce the panelists. We have Dr. Mamnun, who we just realized actually comes from the same college as me. We even overlapped. We probably know each other. He's the author of Being British Muslims, as well as the forthcoming Resilience in the Open Society and Muslims in the Age of Modernity. Outside of his day job, he advises a number of UK organizations on projects and strategies, and as well as founding grassroots initiatives. We also have with us Alissa Symon, who is a PhD scholar in sociology at the University of Oxford. She's actually joining us from Oxford today. She's also a Woolf Institute MPhil alumna and also a Woolf Institute PhD scholar now, and the Jewish chaplain at the University of Cambridge. We also have with us Professor Robert Toombs, who's an emeritus professor of French history at the University of Cambridge. He's become quite a media don of late, and he's also a member of the Woolf Institute Research Committee. Thank you very much for doing that work for us, Robert. And last but certainly not least, we have Dunya Habash, who's doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge in ethnomusicology. She's a PhD scholar at the Woolf Institute and a lead of our Living in Harmony outreach project. And Dunya is joining us from Istanbul. So today's discussion, I'll ask some questions to the panelists, they will answer, and then we'll talk among ourselves. And in the Q&A session at the end, we really want to hear your thoughts and your questions. So if you have any thoughts and questions, please put them in the Q&A box throughout the discussion, and we'll make sure that we devote time in the end for those questions, to explore those questions. So I would like to start with a very general question to the panel. Do you think we're really free to say what we like in any situation, at any cost? I'm thinking about decency, I'm thinking about tactical patience, I'm thinking about equity. Robert, what do you think? Are we free to really express ourselves at any time?
Certainly not. That's simply a fact. In law, we have no legal right of free speech in the United Kingdom other than what is given under the European Convention on Human Rights. But there has never been, and there is not, and I would say there should not be, an unlimited right to free speech. Of course, the classic case is to say you haven't got the right to shout fire in a crowded theatre. And I suppose I would say that it depends so much on context and on circumstances and on intention. So in all proper circumstances, we should be free, but that does not mean that we should be free in all circumstances to say anything we like. But just more, Miriam.
No. What do the others think? Dunya?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree with Robert. I would also add to that the whole decency aspect of things, just general human decency towards one another. and respect for other people's differences in thought, differences in opinion, differences in cultural traditions and worldviews. Because of those differences, sometimes things don't align, and that is okay. And I think in these more modern, globalized, pluralist societies, we are trying very hard to kind of go down the path of being okay with diversity, being okay with people having different opinions. But of course, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think a lot of the issues with what's going on with kind of Muslim communities in the West and anti-Semitism and all sorts of freedom of speech issues that are arising in today's world is a result of our societies kind of working out these kinks. But I do agree with Robert that we should not have ultimate the right to say whatever we want whenever we want it, because sometimes it's not best to say everything, basically.
Mamnun, do you want to give your opinion?
Yeah, I think I agree with those sentiments from Dunya and from Professor Toombs. I think it's important to kind of reflect on what do we mean by being free. Being free is this kind of subjective thing, right? It differs from one person to another, and there are always influences, right, or limitations from our own psychology, our own character, as well as externally imposing influences such as the way we are socialized, our perceptions, the anticipation of what would happen if we say something, and as well as there are norms and rules of engagement, right, which limit the extent to which we can ever be free. Okay, so I think it's important to kind of say these things, and I think all of these things affect or regulate, how we approach being free, and that is specific to each individual. And I think it's important to understand that there's always going to be a tension between what I think I'm expressing, how I want to be free versus how someone else thinks that they want to be free, and the competing nature of me being free and someone else is being free. This has been at the heart of kind of the open society since centuries, for centuries. So I think it's I agree with those sentiments, and yeah, that's what I think about being free, if you like. And from a religious perspective, I can sort of say that we've all got this ego within ourselves. We've got this notion of the importance we have, right? And there's a sense that we are actually constrained by that. In a way, we are slaves to our own egos, right? And so, to what extent can I free myself of that, right? Free myself of those constraints is also an aspect of being free, which isn't necessarily brought into the picture, in these kind of discourses, but is important from a person who's a believer of any of the, I think, Abrahamic faiths.
Alissa, do you want to add something?
Yes, sure. I think, of course, freedom of speech I agree with Robert and with Dunya and what's been said by the other esteemed panelists. Of course, freedom of speech isn't a right that can go forever, and we have to have boundaries. But I also think that censorship is something that is very, very dangerous. I think we can look at other societies where censorship is often used and think about to what height do their philosophical polemics and debates go to. And I think that it's very dangerous to be in a society that is constantly censoring important debates, even if people are sometimes offended by them. And this is something that I feel that in the Jewish community, we often have these kinds of, we're trying to feel where the boundaries are between what is a good debate, which we should be having about rights of women, rights of LGBTQs, things, very hot topics, versus people taking offense and people being feeling that they're being maybe characterized in a light that isn't fair to them. So I think that there are boundaries in these issues, but it's not, to me at least, it's not obvious where the line needs to be drawn. And really every case, I think Robert said this quite rightly, really every case needs to be judged. But censorship, the other side, is very dangerous. And I think that as a society, we should be able to face tough debates and hard questions. The question is, to me, is just how you come about these questions. If you hold respect, if you're doing them really to find the answer and not to aggravate your listener and not to aggravate the social group that you're discussing. So that is just a little bit of my thoughts on the topic.
Thank you, Alissa. So when we talk about religious rights, very often the discussions surrounding freedom of speech center around blasphemy. So the action or offense of speaking sacrilegiously about God or one of the prophets. In the last months, for example, we had in Britain the debate erupting around the Batley School, so all in connection with the blasphemy controversy that erupted there after a teacher showed images of the Prophet Muhammad, cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, when sort of discussing freedom of speech. So these caricatures showing led to protests from the parents, it led to suspension of the teacher and of other staff while the matter was being investigated. So can I first ask you, what do you think generally about this whole Batley School controversy? Do we have the right to offend? Mamnun, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think my understanding is that Islam protects people's right to offend, okay? Because philosophically, without offense, virtue is impossible, yeah? And I think we have to also realize offense is a subjective phenomenon. It's on a gradient, okay? It's not binary, and also it depends on context. But at the same time, so whilst Islam protects people's right to offend, right? At the same time, if we look at what God actually is commanding Muslims, right, and believers to be doing, and that's actually, seeking virtue. And so what God is telling us is, you've got to have emotional intelligence. You've got to put others before oneself. You've got to have patience. You've got to be engaging others in an uplifting way, in a way that's productive, and to get to know them better. So Islam so God is telling me that in Islam, okay? It's not telling me to be belligerent and to be, kind of vindictive, right? And if we look at what's happened in the Batley situation, is that what's happened is the teacher has said, look, well, let's discuss, is blasphemy, is me putting a photo of the Prophet, is that blasphemous? But let me present to you the picture, right? That's almost like saying, let's debate that we, is age-appropriate restrictions, should there be age-appropriate restrictions on pornography, right? But hey kids, let me give you a blue X-rated movie to kind of help you decide that. It's exactly the same sort of insensitive approach that the teacher has used in this situation. And I think aside from the trigger, the question is, how should Muslims respond to this as well? Because Islamic law and the Sharia and Islam isn't for non-Muslims, right? It applies to Muslims. And so how should we react to this kind of offense? And I think that's also important. I think the problem with the Batley situation has been that, you've got the imagery of angry looking Muslim men, right? On a picket line. And that is very unhelpful imagery, right? It plays into the decades-long imagery of extremists shouting in the name of Islam and Muslims. So that hasn't been helpful. And I think the lesson for Muslim is that how can we improve our institutions, right? The Muslim institutions, to engage in a more structured way to deal with these kind of issues, both locally and nationally. And until we do that, we're going to be having these sorts of same problems again and again. And I'm not close enough to judge whether had the Muslims not protested, whether the school would have done anything or not. I'm not close enough to judge that, but that's also something worth recognizing. But the main point is, if we have institutions which can actually engage in these things, and then we can have a better sort of imagery at least coming out of it. That's some thoughts I had. Those are some thoughts I had, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Mamnun. Alissa, do you have a Jewish perspective on blasphemy and how to deal with blasphemy?
Yes, I think at least in Judaism, the common understanding is that it is okay to talk about blasphemy, and to say, I don't believe in God, God doesn't exist, and to debate about it. Of course, in the Jewish world and the philosophical world, there will be arguments, or there will be hard descriptions of those that have decided to not believe in God, or have left the path. Here in England, the common phrase is, they have gone off the derech. They have gone off the path, as if there is one path that we should all be walking on. And then once you stop believing God, you're off the path, you're lost. That is the end for you. But there is room, I feel like there is space within the community to hold these conversations and to say, you know, I'm not sure God exists. And there is even now a trend in the past decade or two of people that describe themselves as orthopractic, which means they conduct themselves in an orthodox manner, practically, but they do not believe in God. And they do this because they love the religion, they love the culture, but they struggle with whether God exists or not. And this is something that I think is much more common than we realize. And obviously it's happening because of secularization. But I do feel that at least I'm not talking about ultra-Orthodox circles, but I do feel that in the Orthodox world in Judaism, and obviously in the Reform and the conservative movement, there definitely is room to talk about blasphemy and to deal with blasphemous content and culture. And I think that is just part of Judaism's DNA. It goes back to the Gemara, where four rabbis went into what we call the Pardes, into the secret garden of God. And one of them came back saying that he doesn't believe in God. And these are stories that we grew up in, right? What happens if you stop believing in God? So it is part of the Jewish culture. And you are allowed to say it, at least in my understanding.
Thank you, Alissa. Robert, as someone with a Catholic background and someone interested in modern politics, what's your take on blasphemy, and what do you think about the Batley School situation?
Yeah, well, I'm what Catholics used to call a lapsed Catholic. It's the equivalent of a Jew who has left the path. So I suppose I speak therefore from a sort of secularist view. I mean, and what I was saying before was that I think was it depends a great deal on context. It's very common for people to say, I mean, I don't believe this myself, but it's very common. It's a commonplace idea for people to say, you know, religion is the source of all evil in the world. All the wars, the persecutions have come from religion. And if we didn't believe in religion, all these problems would disappear. Now, it seems to me that it's okay to say that in a seminar, let's say. And it also seems to me it's okay to say that in a private conversation, even in a public place like a pub. But it would not be all right for me to stand outside the masjid in my street on a Friday afternoon with a megaphone shouting it at people as they come out of the mosque. You know, then you cease to be discussing things and you become harassing and deliberately insulting. And you have no right to do that. And it seems to me that leaves the domain of free speech and it enters into the domain of what the law considers public order. And indeed, I gather from my very limited reading that in English law, blasphemy was a branch of libel. It was one of a number of offences of abuse of speech. And I think that in the case of if you accept that kind of idea that blasphemy is an offence against the community, then it depends almost entirely on how it's done and why it's done. So in the case of the Batley School, as I understand it, and I only know what I read in the papers, this was done with a serious purpose of teaching about blasphemy. It was done after warning children what was going to come. And it was done in a serious and responsible way. And then you have to say, well, who can be offended by this? Or who has the right to claim to have been offended by it? It seems to me that no one has a legitimate right in this case to have claimed to be offended, because not only was there no intention to offend, but the circumstances do not really allow for offense, unless you're absolutely determined to be offended. And in that case, I think we get to the point at which you have to say people have no right to be protected against anything that they choose to regard as offensive. On both sides, therefore, there has to be tolerance. And we shouldn't expect the law or the civil authorities to protect people against extreme claims of being offended or insulted. Though I sort of feel that we're tending rather dangerously towards that point. And I agree very much with what Alissa said about the dangers of censorship, including self-censorship. And we are getting to the point in which people are very worried that things that they say may be considered as hate crime or as something which falls within the law. And I think the law itself, or the police at least, have rather recklessly tended to encourage this view. And also that people might suffer the consequences of, as of course this was the case of the teacher in Batley, would suffer very severe consequences for having done something which is, it seems to me, in no way could be considered wrongdoing.
So how do you respond to Mamnun? Mamnun earlier raised sort of his point of view that, the teacher, he explained that he didn't need to show the image, and he compared it to sort of having to, showing pornography in order to make a point. How do you respond to that then? Okay, well, if these were older children, imagine that you were teaching a lesson on pornography, you might say, well, okay, you wouldn't show a pornographic film, but you could say, this is an example of a pornographic book, and this is why it's considered pornographic by some people. And you could have a debate about what is permissible or not permissible in the sense of pornography. After all, there is a classic case of this, which was the Lady Chatterley trial in 1962, which I was talking to one of my students about the other day and who'd never heard of it, of course. It's like ancient history. But in this case, a novel by D.H. Lawrence was prosecuted on the grounds that it was obscene. It would tend to deprave and corrupt those reading it, and therefore would be criminal. And the debate was really about whether the merits of this as literature outweighed its possible obscenity. And it was decided that it would. And I think in a similar way, you would have to say, okay, if someone is showing blasphemous images or indeed pornographic material in an educational context, does the intention of educating people outweigh the possible objections to the material in itself? And it seems to me that in this case it does. Mamnun, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think the reality is teachers, they would be very, very fearful if they took in a pornographic video into school to explore what is pornography, even with all the caveats and prior sort of warnings that they were going to do this. I think generally I can't see teachers doing that. So the fact that this teacher has done that, knowing that, well, I don't know if he knew that or not, right? What the repercussions would be, but even sort of thinking, having thought through that and kind of presented the cartoon, it just smacks of the teacher not really thinking through, the sensitivities in this area. So has the teacher done enough background work to understand what the debate or the terms of the limits of the debate should be? Just by, to me, it just feels like he hasn't probably thought through all of these things.
I mean, I guess
sorry, Robert, and then Dunya, maybe?
Could I just very briefly say, is the problem here that this is pictorial material? What about if the teacher had been showing, okay, I gave the example of Lady Chatterley's lover. What about if he used extracts from that novel to discuss pornography? Would that be acceptable? And what about if instead of doing a photograph of the Prophet Muhammad, he had used a text, for example, from Salman Rushdie's book as an example of blasphemy in the written word? Would that be more acceptable than a picture?
I think that's a good point there, Robert, you're making. It does, the depiction of the Prophet is actually considered one of those red lines, right, across the world by Muslims. But in terms of text, I think there's much more leeway with the text. People will find it less offensive if there was a text that described the Prophet in a certain way and they were discussing that, rather than picture. Because the picture actually, it's kind of one of those red lines. It's something which they don't allow, in Muslim sort of culture, this kind of depiction of the Prophet. And whereas literature, there's lots of Islamic literature itself which talks about the Prophet and competing sort of hadiths and riwayah, we call it, which depicts the Prophet in certain ways, and those are to be found within mainstream Muslim theological books where debates are happening on that. So I agree, text would be a slightly different. The picture is one of those red lines that Muslims would consider to be a red line.
Dunya, do you want to add something?
Yes, I think this is all very, very fascinating debate, and I agree with bits and pieces of what everyone has been saying. So I agree about the censorship thing. I think there's a line, because it can be scary to suddenly start censoring too much, and then that really limits our ability to have any sorts of debates. But I think Mamnun used a very important term, which is emotional intelligence, and I think this is something that we are forgetting as societies, as our modern societies are becoming much more individualistic, and we're just focusing on the kind of the more philosophical ideas behind some of these debates, and the legalistic issues, and we're forgetting about the fact that a lot of this conversation happens between people and among communities. Like for this Bately school example, as a Muslim, I do think that the reaction is a bit too much. I mean, I understand it. I understand the emotions behind why a teacher who would put an image of the Prophet in one of her lessons would cause such an emotional outburst from the local Muslim community. But I do think that as Muslims, like Mamnun said, we need to have stronger, more developed institutions to deal with these issues in the Western societies in which we are becoming a part of and building communities in. So that's the first thing I would like to say about this. So at the end of the day, it comes back to kind of this, where do we draw the line? And I always tend to favor the side of emotions, of dealing with raw human emotions and how to best do that. I mean, the power of rhetoric in many ways is all about working out people's emotions through logic and through grammar and through speech, and getting people to see things, beyond their emotional capacities. So it's all about how you approach the debate and how you speak about it. So if you start from a position of respect and dignity for the other side, then I think it's much easier to come to kind of middle ways in the conversation. But if you're starting from a position of offense, and I don't understand why Muslims are obsessed with this image of the Prophet, why is it so offensive to them? They need to just get over it and grow up, sort of an attitude, then I think you're going to have lots of problems, especially in today's world where, there's so much against Islam already. And I can tell you that from a personal subjective experience, growing up in the West, in a tradition where I was taught my whole life that this tradition is the correct way. And everything around me is telling me this tradition is full of terrorism. It's full of backwardsness. It's coming from the ancient world, and dealing with those two worldviews basically at the same time is very difficult. And I think this is why Muslims in today's world might be a little bit overreactive to some situations that like this imagery issue with the prophets. So it's just much more complicated than it seems on the surface, these sorts of issues, and we have to remember the whole context. We have to remember the current context. We have to remember the history, where these Muslim communities are coming from, culturally speaking. I mean, think about the fact that across the world, you never see an image of Muhammad in any mosque, in any Islamic cultural civilization. I mean, you can go to any mosque in the Muslim Arab world and you will never see an image of the Prophet. You can go into millions of churches and you see many images. It's just a cultural difference. It's just a difference in worldview. And I think the West needs to understand that this is just something they are not going to get in terms of like the emotional connotations that this sort of a thing does to the Muslim psyche, and they need to just respect that. I mean, that's point blank and simple. I don't think Muslims are saying don't talk about these blasphemous things. They're just saying talk about it in a way that's acceptable to our kind of psychology. So that's what I would have to say about that.
Thank you, Dunya. And you raised the point of sort of individualism and collectivism here. And I think this is maybe my next question. Western individualism and extreme self-expression always seem to be bound in with Protestantism and secularism arising from sort of a Protestant fear. There's actually a very interesting map which I want to share quickly here, which is the Ingelhard-Welzel World Cultural Map, which basically has these different axes. One is survival versus self-expression. So the most self-expressive countries seem to be Protestant countries, whereas the more traditional versus secular values, you see, secular values actually, Confucianism is quite up there, whereas traditional is sort of the African Islamic context. I mean, there's a lot of things to be debated here, but what do you think sort of generally about the secularist versus sort of the self-expression individualist strand versus more collectivist worldviews? Robert, do you want to go first?
I do, but could I say something a little more about Batley before we get on to this?
Oh yes, of course you can.
Because I was afraid we were all going to agree, and clearly I think this is an area where we don't agree. And there are two things that were said that slightly worried me. One was Mamnun saying, or at least saying something that implied that the school at Batley was existing within a Muslim culture. Well, I would say I don't think it does. And then Dunya said, you have to be aware that there are lines that cannot be crossed. Now, if we accept that view, what we would be saying is that the Muslim community in parts of Britain would have the right to decide what can be taught in schools, and would in effect have the implicit right to censor materials used in teaching, either by doing so formally or by doing so through the potential threat of a hostile reaction. And it seems to me that that is not acceptable. For example, if this teacher was, as I think he was, teaching about blasphemy, what you'd be saying, what the teacher has to say is, children, we're going to talk about blasphemy today. You all know that some pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, which were published in France, led to a number of people being murdered. But I can't show you those pictures. And that would implicitly accept that it is not acceptable for these such things to be published in a Western country. And I just think that's going too far. Whether the teacher did it properly or not, I don't know, though I think indications are that he probably did. But I think it's going really rather a long way to say that you have the right to prevent certain teaching materials from being used.
Okay, so Dunya, do you want to respond to that sort of the implicit acceptance that it's okay to murder in the name of this?
I didn't say that.
Okay, sorry, I'm being polemic here.
No, thank you, Robert. I think yes, I understand definitely what you're saying, and that's why I said personally, I think the gut-wrenching emotional reaction that came out of the local Muslim community was too much for me personally as a Muslim myself. I don't think the teacher should have been sacked. I think that was a bit extreme, and obviously in other historical examples, like things that have happened in France, obviously, definitely, I don't agree with Muslims being so offended that they would kill for this sort of a thing. Definitely not. I understand what you're saying also about the censorship issue. And I think what I was saying is not necessarily that, Muslims communities would then come in and be able to change curriculum. I don't think it needs to go that far. I just think that, we should be able to teach these things in a constructive and respectful way that is not offensive to particular communities. I mean, it's like, think about the racism issue in the United States right now. I mean, the US has come a long way to get us to the point where saying, racist slang terms, I'm not going to say them online right now, can get you fired in certain situations, and the US went through a lot of protesting and civil rights and all sorts of stuff to get us to a point as a society where we've accepted that there are certain words we should not use in the public sphere. And I think a similar thing is maybe happening here with the cartoon images of the Prophet. I mean, it's still debatable whether or not it's an extreme thing, like you're saying, but I do think it's on a similar level. This is how offended Muslims feel when images of the Prophet are being used like this in the classroom. You can disagree on whether or not that's overreactive, but this is the reality. It's like a African-American man having an intense emotional reaction to a certain word that is said in reference to him. No one would argue now that that is not his right to feel those emotions, and that's why as societies now, we are trying very hard to filter these words out of our daily speak in the public sphere. So I just think, it's good to compare also to how these things play out in other sorts of ways. So that's what I would say to Robert's comment.
Mamnun, do you want to add something? And then maybe Alissa?
Yeah, I think Dunya put it very nicely there, actually, and she echoes some of my thinking in this area as well. I think it's the point which Robert made about culture. Yeah, no, I wasn't making the point that that the school exists in an Islamic culture. It doesn't. We're living in a secular democracy where liberalism dominates the social scene. So I accept that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the teacher in I don't know if it's a his or her, but the teacher should have sort of done some background work to understand that, hey, I'm going to be teaching Muslims. They already have a big issue with this. So let me just have a bit more emotional intelligence and let me approach this in a way which kind of isn't gonna cause issues. Because as soon as the teacher would have done a bit of research, they would have realized actually stuff like this has caused deaths in other countries. It causes a lot of undoes a lot of social cohesion, and Muslims, a lot of very conservative type of Muslims are finding it difficult to integrate into secular societies because actually they can't see the pulls into that sort of sphere. So let me put all of that into consideration and let me then deal with it. This is what the teacher should have been sort of thinking about, and I'm not sure if the teacher did think about all of this. And that's the point I was trying to make, is understanding the other sort of cultural context in order to then be able to make certain points. And that's the only point, Robert, I was trying to make. Yeah.
Alissa?
Yeah, this has been very interesting to listen to this debate. I'll say a few things. The first thing, I think that maybe my comment is going to try and bridge the gap between Robert and Dunya and Mamnun. I think there was a question about educational profit. What is the educational profit that this teacher was seeking to make from showing the images of the Prophet Muhammad? Does this educational profit, is it high enough to offend the Muslim students sitting in her classroom? Is she gaining, or is he gaining what they're trying to achieve, educationally speaking, through using these images? Sometimes it is okay, I think, to offend your students in a certain way. I think it's a little bit more sticky, this situation, because you're not only offending your students, you're actually coercing them into going against a religious decree that they have. So for the Muslim students sitting in the classroom, it is against their religion to view the pictures of the Prophet. And in doing so, there is a question of what is the educational merit? Had the classroom been one of these schools that we know that doesn't, right, a school that is situated in a place where there aren't any Muslim students, then it's a question whether she can or can't use a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. And I think that Dunya and Mamnun would be a little bit more keen to say, yes, that is okay. And if there is educational benefit, then we shouldn't censor a situation like this. But from an educational point of view, there is a question of what is the profit, the educational profit being made here. I'll say one more thing, and I think that what Dunya said about comparing different situations is important. So for example, here in Oxford over the past couple of years, there's been a great debate about whether you can say a person who was born not a female and converted and changed her sex to become female is a female. And there was a professor here in Oxford that said a female is only somebody who is born with female genitalia. and everybody else is not female, even if they identify as female. And there was a great outcry here against her. And she actually had to be, she was given security because she was receiving death threats. And that is a situation in which obviously she stepped on a terrain of secularist freedom of speech that was very, very dangerous. She was saying something that was sacred, as it is, to other individuals in the community. And it became very dangerous for her to just go about her regular life. And I think that in British society and secular society, we have these terrains, we have these areas where if you say something, you will be, maybe obviously there were petitions for her to get sacked and people saying that she can't teach students and she's not supposed to be in academia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are areas where people really react with high emotions and want to censor the conversation so that they won't have to deal with certain emotional baggage. And what I would say to the case of this woman that was saying in a classroom of students, a female is a person who is born with female genitalia, I'd say, even if somebody who is LGBTQ or somebody who went through a sex change is sitting in that room, I think as a society, we should still be able to have this debate about what is male and what is female and what is the scale. I think it would be very dangerous if we could no longer have this debate. And the same thing I would say about the Muslim case, whereas we need to have the debate about what the educational profit is. And if it is such that the educational profit in the classroom is important for some reason, then I think, yes, we should be able to discuss issues connected to blasphemy and the Prophet Muhammad. Should we be able to show pictures? That is a question of who are the students sitting in that room, because we would not want to create a situation for a student in which he has to go against what God decreed upon him. That is already a little bit sticky. But I think those are the two thoughts that I've had throughout this very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Alissa. We've had a comment from Mark Cosens who says, the issue isn't usually with responsible teachers who forget to do their background research, but with those who like to provoke or even deliberately offend out of their own prejudices. So this sort of reflects some of the comments made by you. So can we come back to sort of the discussion of individualism versus collectivism? And I'm quite interested in hearing what you think about the privilege of an individual to say anything that they want, whether that outweighs the needs of a collective group who want to be able to live together peacefully and sort of avoid these sort of debates. What do you think about that? Dunya, do you want to start?
Yes, very, very good question. This is actually, I've been thinking about this a lot given my research in Turkey right now. So I'm looking at the integration of Syrian migrants in Turkey and, you know, how they fit into kind of the political debates in Turkey right now as well. Because, you know, right now there's this big debate in the public sphere here about the rise of Islamism through Erdogan's party, the AK party, and how that is playing against the kind of secularist agenda, which was, you know, the father of that was Kemal Ataturk when he founded the Republic in 1923, and, you know, made a lot of sweeping reforms to kind of secularize, westernize, and modernize, you know, what was the Ottoman Empire. And you know, so there's a lot of very interesting debates now about this particular issue, which is, you know, Islam versus secularism. And I think it gets down to a lot of these secular values, which one of them is kind of individualism, right? And so a lot of the secularists here feel, and of course these are labels, so I just want to put that out there, you know, these are labels that people use every day. So I know it's much more nuanced than this kind of black and white stuff that I'm saying right now. But, you know, in general, the perception is that a lot of the secularists feel that with the rise of Erdogan and his kind of neo-Ottomanist vision of Turkey, that there will be losing a lot of these rights that come with kind of Western secular societies, such as, you know, freedom of speech, individualism, all sorts of things. So, you know, and it's coming up against this more kind of neo-Islamic collective imaginary that, you know, arguably Erdogan is trying to recreate, right? So a lot of people say that he's trying to kind of recreate the Ottoman Empire again, and he's the Sultan of the new Ottoman Empire in today's world. So again, you know, these debates are alive in many parts of the world, not just in the West, you know, so that's one thing to bear in mind. And I just think it's very difficult, because I think growing up in America, growing up knowing, learning about this kind of individual way of life, you know, it's very easy to forget that a lot of other cultures and other peoples they don't live like that. You know, they see themselves as part of collective communities a lot more than they do as this individual person who's just trying to have a professional career, trying to break away from, you know, the family, to build themselves, to make something of themselves in today's world, working far away from the family. Of course, I did all of these things, but I did them, you know, kind of against what I was taught was culturally acceptable from my Syrian American background. So these things are difficult. I mean, when you grow up in you know, a certain way of view, it's hard to kind of jump into these more kind of individual secular Western identities. I think we forget that a lot of the times. We forget that these communities have their own backgrounds, their own ideas about what it means to live a good life, what it means to be part of a social fabric, what it means to have relations with other family members, with friends, with society. And, you know, we're trying to kind of force a lot of these communities to just kind of get on with their development, you know, and kind of see the light of secularism and the individual way of living. But a lot of people don't want to do that. And a lot of people want to continue with their kind of collective way of living, because it gives them a sense of self and a sense of purpose. And I think that's fine. We just need to be okay with the fact that collective life or collective imaginary for some people is fine. We don't need everyone to follow into this individual secular push that's happening in a lot of globalized places around the world. So I just think there's just a lot to work out. You know, there's so much debate that needs to happen about these issues, and we need to be talking about these things a lot more in the public sphere also, and the communities themselves. I think to bring it back to the community level as well, they need to accept that this is part of modern life. These ideas, there are people who are living like this now, and that's okay. And they should engage with those people and engage with these ideas, take what they can from them, learn from them. I mean, it just needs to be a bit more open from both sides in terms of talking to each other and learning from each other and growing together as a society. So that's what I would say. Yeah. I kind of did a long-winded thing there, but I hope it kind of answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dunya. I mean, again, the West isn't entirely homogeneous there. I mean, there are, but probably when we're thinking the West, we're thinking sort of English-speaking USA and UK perhaps, but even within Europe, there are of course a lot of variations between the different countries. And then, having grown up in East Germany, I mean, I grew up in a very, very collective culture, which was very happy to sacrifice any individual over the collective. So, I mean, that shift also within a few years from a collective culture to an individual culture broke a lot of people. It was very, very traumatizing for a lot of East Germans. Robert, you're unmuted. Do you want to have anything to add?
Oh, I can always add things if you want me to. Yeah, I agree that there is a very interesting discussion to be had about societies which are more based on individuals and others that are more based on family or wider groups. I mean, there's a respectable argument that English individualism goes back to the 14th century. So it's not just the product of 20th or 21st century globalization. It goes much deeper. But on the point of free speech, to sort of drag us back to that, I mean, I'm not sure I accept your your analysis that this is simply a question of individualism against collectivism, because you could say that the right to free speech, or at least the acceptance of free speech as a good thing, is a collective possession of our culture. And in some senses, people or even individuals who are saying, because I am offended, I have the right to prevent you from saying this thing. This is a kind of individualism which is being imposed on the collectivity. How about that as a paradox?
We have a question from Lina Malakotis Liederman, and she's asking, in response to the comment that there is more leeway or flexibility with text literature when it comes to Muslim sensitivities or issues of blasphemy, how can we understand and interpret the backlash against Salman Rushdie's Satanic verses? Mamnun, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. I think the Satanic verses, if you look at when it happened, right, Muslims weren't really in the public sphere. Muslims in the UK, a lot of my ancestors, my grandfather came in the late 1950s, and then we had an explosion, of Muslims, and now it's got to, from the 1950s where there was about 100,000 to now where there's over 3 million. And and generations have sort of built their life here and have become indigenized, if you like, into the British way of living, and into English and Scottish and Welsh ways of living, right? So that has been a period of indigenization, if you like. And when the Satanic verses happened, it was quite early in that period. So it was like the first kind of awakening of Muslims in the UK, where suddenly something was being said about the Prophet and crafted in a story, which it was for the first time, it was a reaction to all of that, and they had no institutions or no way of dealing with that. So what you got actually was a blunt reaction, right? And it just caught the imagination of the media, because here's Muslims for the first time in the UK just marching on the roads on something which they find offensive. And it was I wouldn't look too much into that and think, because Muslims in the UK have come a long way from those days. So I would not look into that. It's a historical thing that happened. Today, if you see how would Muslims react, well, actually, within our Islamic sort of circles, we're having these debates. Imam al-Tabari and many others, famous exegetes, actually have a lot of these texts within their own texts, right? And people are examining them and talking about them. So we've come a long way. I don't think we should go back and look at what happened in the 80s and 90s on the reaction to Satanic verses. And also there was a lot of influence from outside on this as well. So we hadn't created a British indigenized response to that, right? A British Muslim response to that. It was kind of imported what was going around the world. There was massive outcry in Iran and the fatwa that happened there against Salman Rushdie, etc. So I think it's a historical event that happened. I wouldn't look too much on it to kind of say what's happening today.
I think this is something we hear quite a lot, that actually the Satanic verses probably wouldn't cause any controversy in the modern era. So we're drawing to a close now. And I think before we go, I just want to, because this is the How to Talk About series, and I just want to have perhaps a few succinct statements from you, how you think we can best approach talking about the subject. And what would be helpful to you to improve dialogue on the topic, to make sure that both sides engage more meaningfully? Robert, do you want to start with that? So what would you like to hear if you engage with speakers from the other side, where you locate yourself?
Well, I think it's difficult. And indeed, what I've heard in the discussion today makes me feel in some ways, more pessimistic about the possibility of having this kind of dialogue. Because I don't think there is much of a meeting of minds between us, in the sense that I would have said, you have the right not to be insulted, aggressed, harassed. But what I think Mamnun and also Dunya to some extent have said is that you have, even if you personally are not involved in a particular event, you have the right to react against it. So that in the case of the Batley School, which we keep coming back to, as far as I know, the children in the school, the children in the class were not offended. It was people who had nothing to do with the school who expressed offense. And that seems to me dangerous and something that is not acceptable. And I can't really see how I would ever feel that it was justifiable.
Okay, Mamnun and Dunya, do you want to react?
Yeah, I think I don't see, I think there's a lot of lot of overlap between how we approach freedom and expression. Maybe I haven't been able to express that. And Robert, I think from what you said, there's a lot of things I actually agree with. On the Batley situation, what you have to realize is, and I think this is about, do we as in society, in the UK society, understand what's actually going on, how our British Muslims community is sort of organized? If you like, there's a lot of parenting in Muslim communities where parents want to instill sense of values and sense of traditional sort of understanding of morality and these things, right? They're very hungry to try and instill that in their kids. So they're very, they will naturally react, right, to something like this, even if their kids didn't, because they want to pass over some of that traditional, cultural, conservative sort of understanding of certain values, right? And that's why you got that reaction there. I don't think it's necessarily the fact that, kids are products of our parents, right? Of parents. I don't think you can separate out kids from parents, and parents can't say anything about what's going on in schools. In fact, the fact that they got involved, I wish they got more involved in schools, get more involved, help out kids, get more with the curriculum, understand, talk to teachers, be much more integrated with the school system than not. But to your question, I think, how would I want people to address all of this? I think we need much more deeper understandings of our cultural context that we're all coming from, and to be able to understand where the other's perspective is, to be able to seek a kind of a reconciliation with that, and not to polarize ourselves. So look at syncretic ways, things we both share and agree on, and then understand there will be differences. And it's important to have differences, because actually that's how truth manifests, or that's how we better ourselves, by challenging it and disagreeing. And when we do disagree, to understand the perspective and to do it respectfully and with decency, that would be my sort of lasting sort of way I would encourage people to talk about this.
Dunya, and then Alissa.
Yes. I'm sorry, Robert, that you feel that there was a lot of disagreement here. But I think I don't think we're really disagreeing, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying in terms of like we need to be able to debate important issues. We need to be able to speak about difficult things without feeling that there's going to be crazy reactions from the people involved and local communities and sort of a thing. And I definitely agree with you, and that's why I emphasize that I think the reaction from the Muslim community to the Batley School was a bit too much. It was extreme. I don't think the teacher should have been sacked. I think there should have been more dialogue in terms of how that situation played out. I think the only point that I'm trying to make with everything I've said today is that there should be a way for us to talk about difficult things in a respectful manner. That's all. I think I saw there was someone who put in the chat here, in Islam, one is taught that Muhammad is more dear than oneself. See, I'm not sure a lot of non-Muslims know that, for example, like that this is a teaching that you grow up with as a child in the tradition, so the Prophet and his place in your psyche as a believer is very, very esteemed and very high. And therefore, anything that is blasphemous towards him is seen as more than taboo. I mean, it's very, very difficult to deal with that as a believer. So I think, that's something that shouldn't be too difficult for non-Muslims to understand. And then I think Muslims also need to understand that, in kind of the non-Muslim world, having open debates and critical debates is very important for the the British subjectivity, for example, or the non-Muslim subjectivity. I mean, that's part of progress, right? Being able to talk critically and to debate openly about difficult things. So Muslims also need to understand that maybe it's not always an offensive thing, or coming from kind of an attacking pedestal. Sometimes it really is just, let's talk about these things. So I think, if both sides can kind of understand the differences in where they're coming from, then maybe we can have a bit more of a level grounded debate with each other, where emotions can be put on the side as much as possible. I think that's what I would say.
Thank you, Dunya. Alissa, we're drawing to a close, but I'll give you the sort of the final statement.
Thank you. I'll say two things as a final statement. The first thing I'll say is that I think we need to differentiate between different arenas where we have conversations and what kind of conversations we can have in different arenas. The arena of the classroom, where the teacher is higher in hierarchy than her students, is one type of arena that I think we should be very careful about how far we can go with freedom of speech, because it's not a situation where we're all equal, and it's not a situation where everybody feels protected in the same way. And that's one arena where we can think about what are the borders of freedom of speech. And then we have arenas like university, where I think freedom of speech needs to be a much higher issue, and scholars should be able to say almost anything, really, because this is where we debate ideas. That's the arena of university. In school, with school children, we educate, and in universities, I think we debate to a much greater extent. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that for people of faith, myself included, as a Jew, for example, there are certain things that I expect society to hold in its conscience when it's talking to me. Okay, for example, I will expect somebody, a colleague of mine, not to say to my face that he thinks the Holocaust didn't happen. Okay, that would be very offensive to me as an individual. And I think the same thing we can ask society to see that if it's somebody coming from the Muslim faith, clearly to say, here's a picture of Muhammad, that is a little bit, that would be like saying to a Jew, I don't think the Holocaust happened. That is something that is just offensive and shouldn't be said. But at the same time, I think that we as religious people should not expect society to know exactly the list of whatever things that offend us. And that we should also carry that we are minority communities. And as minority communities, we need to bridge our way into society. And it's not only that society needs to be nice to us and pleasant to us and know everything about our faiths to make us feel good in society. No, there will also be situations in which we as people of faith will feel uncomfortable, and that is part of our integration into secular society, because we want to be part of secular society. And sometimes it will be painful, and sometimes it will hurt, and sometimes I'll hear things that are not so easy for me to hear. But I will have to hear them because I'm part of the society, and I don't want to censor the conversation around the fact that I am a person of faith. I'm a person of faith, and I've heard in many conversations, God doesn't exist, all those that are religious are idiots, etc., etc. And I didn't leave the room because it's okay to hold those opinions. I can deal with those opinions. So I think those are just the two things. What can we do to make freedom of speech better and these issues better? We need to recognize what the arena is and be very, very mindful of the different arenas in which we're having debates. And the second thing, people of faith should be aware that not every single thing that they hold dear is going to be respected. And society should also try and mark in their minds what are the very big no-nos when you're talking to, for example, a Jewish person or, for example, a Muslim person, just as they would hold dear when they're talking to somebody, for example, who is from the LGBTQ community or somebody who has been through a sex change, is what I would say.
All right. Thank you, Alissa. So I think we have to draw this to a close now because we're over time already. And we can still stay in this webinar, but we'll say goodbye to the live audience now. And basically this will end the recorded part of the evening. There will be a bit more by ourselves, and people can, sort of the audience, the webinar audience can sign out. So thank you very, very much for this enriching. I thought it was a very enriching and fascinating conversation. We had some very, very nice comments, which we'll read now once we stop the live stream. So thank you, audience, for joining us today. For information about upcoming events, please check out the Woolf Institute website. This event was brought to you as part of a digital festival that we are having this week. Tomorrow, there is another video premiere about the transition of leadership at the Woolf Institute. And on Friday, there's a digital exhibition launch. So if you don't, you're most welcome to come this not to be missed events. Thank you again to the panel, and we say goodbye now, and we keep in the webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.